I have been receiving the letters for well over 50 years, although now it's more often I will get an email from him. Usually threatening, sometimes cordial or boastful, occasionally almost begging me to return to the small town of Fairview. A few years after they started, he began to claim to have found the little girl and described in vivid detail how he tore her to shreds. I was worried he may have been telling the truth for over a decade until I managed to track her down in the summer of '71 and discovered she had grown into a lovely young woman residing in Kingsport. When I informed him of her safety in one of my rare replies to him, he responded with a 59-page long diatribe about how he was going to torture me to death. Now, after all these years, I feel that I should return for one final hunt and a career in the supernatural. It would be fitting that Fairview would be the location of my first and last encounter with the paranormal. But I am getting rather ahead of myself. In the summer of '54, I had just graduated from high school and decided to take a small vacation on my own. Having never been one for large crowds, I settled on the small town of Fairview, which I had heard had some of the most stirring natural landscapes in the state, especially the lush forest that surrounded it on every side. I had scheduled a 2-week stay at the Fairview Coyote Inn and left that morning to enjoy a scenic drive through the countryside. When I finally arrived in town, it was almost evening, but I still took time to stop at the town limits and admire the famous sign which had become a somewhat obscure legend in the surrounding area. The version I had heard from a schoolmate said that it had been stolen from the local, now bankrupt and closed, zoo by a gang of vandals during the First World War, and erected in its current position for reasons only a heavily inebriated mind could fathom. The zoo owner apparently never bothered to retrieve it, and so it stood until no one could imagine the town without it. It read, 1. Animals may not leave their habitat. 2. Animals who harm visitors or staff will be punished. 3. Do not, under any circumstances, feed the animals. Having satisfied my curiosity, I drove to the hotel and checked in. The owner was extremely friendly and asked if, since the porter was homesick that day, I might go into the next room and ask the maintenance man, whom he affectionately called Old Ralph, to help me with my bags. Old Ralph was a large man. Only slightly taller than average, his waist was extremely robust and his arms were well muscled. He had white hair and a long and extremely shaggy beard. I politely asked for his assistance and he grudgingly and silently stood and walked to the lobby to help with my bags. Simply trying to make conversation on the way to my room, I remarked on the picture of a coyote and the inn's logo. He replied, through clenched teeth, that "It's no damn coyote, you," after which he trailed off into mumbling. He unceremoniously dumped my belongings outside my door and left without a word. I, tired from my trip, simply moved my belongings inside and went to sleep. The next day, I spent my time in town and exploring the woods. It was utterly remarkable how polite and friendly every person I met was. Every single one was incredibly happy to help me in any way. One man, upon being asked directions to a place which happened to be across town, happily walked me the entire distance. I thought it was unusual but hardly alarming and actually found I enjoyed myself in their company. When I returned for the evening, I met the family who had moved into the room next to mine. I was surprised to find they were black, and their presence in a white hotel can only be attributed to the townsfolk's universal desire to help apparently anyone, an attitude I found surprisingly progressive. After a pleasant chat, I turned into my room and settled in to watch television. Unfortunately, the set suddenly stopped working and I went out to fetch the repairman. The clerk in the lobby happily went to find him when I asked for him, and I was told to return to my room. Some few minutes later, old Ralph knocked on my door and asked, extremely irritated, "Yeah, what's the problem you got that's so bad you need to wake me up for?" I pointed to the television, and before I could utter a word, he strode over to it, knocked its side with the back of his hand, and turned it on. "Works just fine, you idiot." He done left before I could reply. A few seconds after him leaving, I heard him bump into something and begin cursing loudly. I peered outside and saw him berating Mr. Jackson from the next room. Ralph was absolutely livid, practically foaming at the mouth while hurling insults and curses at him. Jackson looked angry while his wife and their child stood in the doorway, afraid. I saw that the clerk looked entirely nonplussed, bearing an expression as if to say, "Oh well, best just ignore it and write it out." Ralph continued his ranting for full-on 5 minutes until Jackson demanded that he stop doing this in front of his daughter. Ralph, with a new glint in his eyes, said, "What? Want me to shut up so your Ken can go back to raping the little slut? You dumb Negro, just do it out here in the open. Nobody expects any more, yeah?" Jackson, shaking in rage, punched old Ralph square on the jaw. I was shocked both by the display of violence but also by Ralph's reaction. He looked like he had just won the lottery. He was grinning ear to ear and laughing like a madman. He merely walked away without another word. I, confused beyond the reason and simply wanting to distance myself from the situation, returned to my room and spent the night normally until it was time to sleep. That night, I was awoken by sounds from the next room. It sounded as if someone were beating on the door. This lasted only a few seconds before being replaced with the sound of a wooden door splintering and human screams. I rushed out of bed and entered the next door. I saw a large, brown, hairy creature hunched over the dismembered torso of Mr. Jackson, while his wife tried to beat the creature away with the room's lamp. The creature, approximately the size of a gorilla with a canine head, most closely resembling that of a hyena, ignored her and continued feasting on Jackson's limbs. I would like to say I bravely charged in and fought off the beast, but reacted how most people would, by standing paralyzed by fear, trying to rationalize it away as some bizarre nightmare. After finishing Jackson, it turned its attention to his wife, who was by now hysterically beating at it with the remains of the lamp. I watched as it ate her, bit by bit, starting with her legs, then arms, and finally her torso and head. It was only when I looked up and began slowly creeping towards the corner the girl was crying in, as if savoring the terror it was inflicting her, that I sprang into action. I jumped in its way just as it was reaching for her, causing it to swat me aside. I was launched across the room and I was sure I would see it killing her when I looked up. Instead, the creature was staring at me with what can only be described as abject terror. "No, no, 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 no," it pleaded in old Ralph's raspy voice. Then it doubled over, clutching its stomach. It began vomiting up blood and the remains of the 2 people it had just ingested. Taking the opportunity, I grabbed the girl in my arms and ran back to my room, locking and barring the door. I could hear it screaming after a few minutes. "Not fair." He got in my way. He interfered. Shouldn't count. That shouldn't count. After an hour of the screaming from the next room, the sound suddenly stopped. After a few more hours, exhaustion overcame my fear and I must have fallen asleep. Sometime later, I woke to 2 glowing yellow eyes just in the front of my face. I screamed as loud as I could, but knew I had nowhere to run. Soon, I realized it wasn't moving, it was just staring at me. I collected myself as best I was able and noticed that the door had not been broken. It had been opened normally, and the cabinet had been pushed aside. The monster calmly spoke to me. "You'd better start fighting back, or I'll kill you and that girl." Pausing for a moment to give me some chance to respond, he continued, "Come on, I'm sure you can do it. I'm just an animal after all, right? A big, strong human like you can kill me. Just pick something heavy and bash my skull in. What's the matter? Scared?" I remained mute, praying there was some way I could get away from this horrible thing crouched over me. Do you know how hard it is living here? Not one single person in this whole fucking town will touch me. Not when I insult them or smash their windows, or when I tear someone apart in the middle of the street. They don't even notice me. But you, tourists, are different. You've got fight in you. Come on, do it. Do it. I said fight me now. With that, it raised a claw to swipe at me, but before it could, it collapsed once again, making hacking sounds like a man trying to vomit on an empty stomach. I took the opportunity to run to my car and drive away with the girl. Knowing no one would believe my story, I left the girl at a police station at a nearby town and told her to tell them she didn't know where her parents were. I told my parents that I had been very ill and decided to cancel the vacation after only 2 days. I thought I was finally safe and spent the next few days feigning illness. It was about a week later the first letter arrived. It was from old Ralph, who told me in plain terms and colorful language that he was going to hunt me down and kill me, and that I should try to find him before he could find me. I confess I was frightened, but I reasoned that if he could come for me, he wouldn't have sent a letter instead of coming himself. That he has spent the last half-century harassing the one who got away, as he calls me, attests that my guess was correct. I think that after I have passed on all my knowledge of the supernatural to able apprentices, I'll make my last foray into Fairview. It will be one final mission, after which I will either be retired or dead. I think the world as a whole should be safe either way. I know you're probably reading this. God knows you stalked me online enough to make up for your inability to do so in reality. But even if I do die, an animal like you isn't allowed to leave his habitat. Right, Ralph? I met my best friend Ben when I was 19. We started a degree in music together and had absolutely nothing in common, which we loved about each other. What shocked us was how in sync our childhoods had been. From being born 2 weeks apart to the age of 12, we shared a lot of experiences even though we never met. I remember Ben telling me about a VHS he used to have with Huxley Pig and Will Quack Quack cartoons on it, saying how obscure it was and how I love it. I replied that I knew exactly which VHS he was referring to and also still had a copy of it. This sort of thing happened a lot between us, so we liked to quiz each other from time to time, then joke about how different we were for our identical upbringings. One night, when I was staying over at Ben's house, we got on the topic of kids' ghost stories. I love creepy stories, but Ben hates them, so the conversation was slow going at first. We started with the usual stories kids in the neighborhood spread. It was funny how many of our town's stories were exactly the same for being opposite sides of the city and river, 10 miles from each other. They had both heard about a one-eyed black cat nobody owns that watches the children play out. The list of stories went on, as did the similarities. Ben got surprisingly into the discussion. "So you've even heard of this story?" etc., to which I confirmed or told my town's slightly different version of the story. That's how the night progressed. After we exhausted the conversation, he ended with, "Even to this day, I'm still scared of the dogman, so please tell me you've heard that story too." I just remember being dumbfounded, saying I had no idea what a dogman was. As far as I'm aware, the dogman story is just in Ben's town. We tried looking on the internet, but Ben was too easily freaked out by pictures and scary stories that popped up as we searched. The dogmen really grabbed my attention. Usually kids' ghost stories go into so much detail, like the color of the ghost's dress or the exact way the hair hangs over the ghost's eyes. There wasn't much information about the dogman. The details were vague. His words at the time were something like, The other kids who were allowed at the street told us about dogmen who stood around in the alleys at night, and the older kids were shamelessly scared to go there when it got dark. Obviously, it was thugs or druggies, I explained, but he was adamant. No, because they ran away when they noticed the kids watching them. They'd climb up the high walls of the back alley into people's backyards really fast without making a noise. The older kids wouldn't talk about it unless pushed. He said their feelings seemed too real to make it a joke to scare the younger kids. His childhood friend, Wes, claimed to have seen one too. The story goes that the dogmen would be found standing in small groups, or more often solitary in the middle of an alley, looking for scraps of food, not doing much else. Ben seriously thinks he saw one with his mom one day walking back from the shops. Apparently, it was in a fenced-off area where a block of flats had been demolished a few years earlier. At the opposite side of this land, he saw a skinny, hunchbacked man cupping his hands full of water from a stream which ran through the plot, washing his long, greasy hair, almost ritualistically. Even though he didn't see the homeless man's face and was quite far away to make out details, he swears something about that man wasn't quite human. I blame the child's imagination and exaggerated memories, but he swears it. He showed me the area that next morning. If he and his mother are remembering correctly, I have no idea why even a homeless man would wash his hair in that dirty stream. I first met Wes a few weeks after the night I had learned about the dogman, and didn't hesitate to ask for his first-hand account of the dogman. It was the main reason I decided to meet him after all. His description was similar to Ben's, but his encounter was far more close up. Wes lived further from the local corner shop than Ben and used to take a shortcut through an alley where he walked there. The wheelie bins were out that day. He said that he could hear a cat or a dog feeding on some discarded food behind one of the bins. It happens a lot, and everyone knows to keep a distance so the dog won't get aggravated and attack. But Wes said the dog didn't look right. He only got a quick glance before it ran behind the wall with a rotten roast chicken hanging from its mouth. According to his memory, it was running more like a hyena than a normal dog, with its shoulders held much higher than its hips. The snout was too short and the ears were more elfin than a dog's. He can't remember if the creature had fur or not, but it definitely was naked. Not long after, he overheard the older kids talking about the dog man and realized what he had seen. I like Wes. He has a doubting attitude akin to mine and admitted his memory may have been influenced by the older kids' stories. It could have just been a normal dog struggling to carry a whole chicken away after being startled. The story lay dormant, not mentioned for months after I spoke to Wes. In that time, I had moved away and have only managed to visit Ben 3 times since then. The last time I met with him, we decided to go to the local takeaway in the early hours of the morning, and I got my very own encounter of what could have been dogmen. Right on the same abandoned plot where Ben saw the homeless man bathing, there was a decent-sized fire burning. I could make out possibly 3 silhouettes huddled around the flames. Ben's area is pretty rough, so this isn't an unusual sight, but I don't know how to describe it. Those figures weren't moving naturally. My view wasn't great because Ben wouldn't move closer than we were, but I swear those silhouettes never stood completely upright. We watched them for about 5 minutes. They were hunched over with their backs to us, warming their gloved hands by the fire with their hoods up. I remember one of them moving closer to the fire while keeping its hands on the ground. Would have been easier to just stand and walk closer, but it shuffled awkwardly using its arms. Everything about their movements were indescribably awkward. I was so excited. It had to have been the dogmen. Didn't want them to spot us, so we left pretty soon after, but I forced Ben to visit the bonfire with me the next day. There was just a milk crate sat next to a charred circle on the ground. nothing to prove these beings were inhuman. Strangely, there were bones in and amongst the smoldering papers and branches that had been burning the night before. Could make out sooty handprints where at least one of the homeless people had presumably crawled directly over the charred ground. The trail of handprints led away from the bonfire and faded after a couple of meters. That was all we found. We walked away feeling slightly silly, laughing at how we had probably been stalking a trio of drunk tramps. However, Ben's realization unnerved us terribly. As the hand trail faded, he pointed out a large paw print becoming more and more prominent in the middle of the fading handprints. Then it struck me why I found their gait so weird the night before. As that man had walked closer to the fire, he placed his feet in the exact same spot where his hands had been. We stared in shock, not sure what to make of the trail. Then the yelps and growls of dogs fighting came from a bush uncomfortably close to us. I'm not ashamed to say we ran away crapping ourselves. Maybe it was just a pack of dogs. We didn't care to look, and I'm never going back there to find out. I don't know where else to share my story, so I've just come to the first website that pops up when you search Goatman. I don't really care where I post it. The only thing that matters is that it's posted. My name is Richard, but if you don't mind me doing so, I'd prefer to skip the pleasantries and proceed with my story. I first came to know the tale of this frightful creature around a year ago during a school expedition that took us hiking through some desolate forest somewhere in rural England. The trip was actually completely normal and nothing disturbing happened whatsoever. But as we sat down at the campfire one night, one of the students, whose name I didn't know, suggested that we tell some scary stories around the campfire. As cliché as it sounded, we all agreed and decided to take in turns. The student who came up with the idea stated that they would go first, as they had a pretty good story saved up for a moment such as this. They told the tale of a humanoid creature that, for the most part, possessed the body of a human, but that it had the head and legs of a goat. Naturally, it was labeled as the Goatman, and the student went on to speak of the creature and its endeavors into the awful. The story is the only one I remember from that night, with the rest of the stories all being based around the same generic plot, concerning a bloodthirsty creature who was on the hunt for human flesh. Easily forgettable, to say the least. What scared me about the story of the Goatman and successfully imprinted into my memory was that it supposedly didn't kill people, or rather that it didn't kill them straight away. The Goatman could shapeshift into any creature, be that a person or an animal. It didn't even need something ritualistic such as a drop of their blood. It could just transform at will. I vividly remember the student ending his tale by reminding us once more that the Goatman preferred to mentally exhaust its prey before ending their lives in a variety of unimaginably gruesome ways. Although it would very rarely show itself in its true form, the student said. Victims would typically see it take dozens of appearances throughout very short time periods. This tale was slowly but surely pushed to the back of my mind over the next couple months, with me sitting important exams and entering a transition period where many students would leave my school in order to pursue their studies elsewhere, being replaced by a more optimistic bunch who were so happy throughout their first few days at the school that it made the rest of us uncomfortable. You can relax though. They weren't brain-eating aliens sent from another planet to destroy the human race, and their blissful mood soon vanished, being replaced with a harsher, more realistic one that suited the repetitive nature of school life. During this transition period, a number of people I knew left the school, with some of my close friends throwing goodbye parties whilst other people, such as the student who first introduced me to the tale of the Goatman, practically vanishing. The story of the Goat Man was forcefully reintroduced to me today during a trip I made to the National Art Gallery with a small group consisting of my 2 closest friends. We made our way through the various sections of the gallery over the course of a couple hours. But weird and seemingly unexplainable things would occasionally happen to the group of us. The most alarming of these things was most certainly when I witnessed firsthand my friend James exiting the room containing Van Gogh's Sunflowers through a door located on the right side of the room before reappearing through the door on the opposite side of the room moments later. This feat was clearly impossible due to the way the building was laid out, but when the remaining 2 of us started walking towards James and questioning how he had just done that, he quickly backed out of the door without uttering a word. We concluded this was a practical joke, but before we could exit the room after James, he shouted to us from the right-hand side of the room that he had initially exited out of. He yelled, "You guys coming or not?" and was seemingly clueless when we caught up to him and questioned him about the events that had just transpired. I was somewhat shaken by this initially, but refused to accept that it could have been anything but a practical joke. Whilst this was the only largely creepy thing that occurred within the gallery, with the only other noticeable occurrences being a few people smiling at us in creepy ways and one woman who supposedly walked up to my friend Charlotte and began talking to her in a language Charlotte could only describe as cryptic. Things only got worse once we decided to depart. As we drove back to our town, I stared out of the window and dozed off, suddenly awaking out of nowhere as the car stood stationary at some traffic lights. Rubbing my eyes, I gazed out of the window once again, but was jolted awake when I saw the kid who had first told me the story of the Goat Man all those months ago, staring at me from the other side of the road. He had an eerie grin on his face, but in true horror movie fashion, I did the stupidest thing imaginable, and opened the car door before running up to him smiling back, fully prepared to catch up with him and ask where he'd been. I hadn't thought about the Goat Man so far that day up until I saw the boy from the hiking trip standing there, and looking back on it, I'm pretty sure that the Goat Man knew this too. He wasn't willing to let me forget. Just before I made it to the other side of the road, a car came speeding out of nowhere and passed right in front of me, missing me by mere inches. I flinched and impulsively clenched my eyes shut, only opening them when I sensed the danger had passed. I almost jumped out of my skin when I focused on where the boy whose name I didn't know had been standing, only to come face to face with an elderly man who, despite his drastically changed features, wore the same creepy smile on his face. I turned and sprinted back to the car where my 3 friends had observed the entire event from. I knew I couldn't have been hallucinating when I saw the looks of abject terror etched across their faces. I jumped in, closed the door behind me, and James slammed his foot down on the gas. The 4 of us sat in silence, with the only conversation we had occurring when James attempted to pull into his driveway, before Charlotte shouted at him to turn the car around and head towards the nearest police station. He began to question her, but she cut him off, and the desperation in her voice told us that something was very wrong. James kept his eyes on the road as he drove towards the station, and Charlotte looked out the window as she sat next to him, occasionally catching my gaze as she glanced back in my direction, a look of unwavering concern overshadowing her usually calm demeanor. We eventually reached the police station and I got out of the car. We reached the door to the station before Charlotte grabbed me and twisted me around, forcing me to look back at the car. I caught a glimpse of a figure dragging its leg behind as it shuffled off in the other direction, features indistinguishable in the cover of the night. "What?" I asked her as I observed the figure, somewhat rationally assuming it was someone departing from the police station after having been interviewed regarding an injury to their leg. "Richard," she whispered to me, voice evidently close to giving out and with tears in her eyes. "The thing was in the car with us. Did you somehow not notice it? There were 3 of us in the car when we arrived and began to leave the gallery, but a while after you got back in, I caught sight of it. It was sitting next to you in the back. I was watching it from the wing mirror of the car, and it just sat there, smiling at you for the entire journey with this horrible, indescribable smile." Her voice trailed off as she finished her sentence, and I was left more terrified than I'd ever been and never will be in my life. There was no way I couldn't go an entire hour-long car journey without noticing somebody sitting next to me. It was impossible, and I knew it. Yet it had happened. My feet gave out from the sheer panic I was experiencing and collapsed to the floor with an audible thud. Now my eyes were filling up with tears too, but I swear I saw the silhouette in the distance turn around to look at me one final time before shuffling off into the night. The police heard us out, but took no action, as all we really had to talk about was a couple of people smiling at us creepily and an account of somebody slipping into our car. Having been noticed by the person who sat in the passenger seat in front of it, yet somehow evading the sight of James and myself, despite supposedly staring at me for the entire journey. I explained to them the story of my hiking trip and of the goat man, but it was met with raised eyebrows despite my pleading and protesting. By this point, I would have started questioning my own sanity had I not been sitting next to 2 others who had shared this horrific experience with me. Eventually, the police said they'd come and visit each of our houses the following morning for more information after we had a sleep, and that we should call them if anything else out of the ordinary happened. They escorted each of us home, and we decided to reconvene the following day at James' house in order to try and piece together what had happened over the course of the day. I was the last to be dropped off, and the policeman who was driving the squad car told me that they'd keep a unit on standby throughout the night, and they would be dispatched to my address immediately should I dial the emergency services. He flashed me a smile as he rolled up the window of his car, and I froze momentarily before shrugging it off. I was able to muster a faint laugh as I looked at my predicament, with me now being so paranoid that I was coming within inches of a heart attack whenever somebody did so much as smile in my direction. However, my fears were very much reasonable, and maybe, just maybe, I was correct to have been scared by his smile. I dare not look back as I made the long walk up my driveway and into my house, being sure to lock and bolt the door behind me before searching the entire house for any open windows. Every window in the house was closed, but that didn't stop me from locking them too. I tried sleeping in my room with the lights on, but I found that my mind refused to rest and instead desired to wander. I came up with endless explanations, but there was one so terrifying that I was forced to get out of my bed and roam around the house, keeping any suspicious movement going on outside. Perhaps it should have been obvious to me earlier, but I had so much going through my mind that I only just come to the realization that I'd never seen the boy who told me about the goat man and appeared to me on the side of the road anywhere apart from on that hiking trip. Desperate to be proven incorrect, I grabbed my yearbook and began frantically tearing out the pages. Minutes later, I was a sobbing mess, having gone through the entire yearbook but not found a single person resembling him. Now, it was clear to me. The goat man himself was the one who had told me the tale of the goat man, and the boy he was capable of shapeshifting into must have been a past victim or something along those lines, seeing as I'd never seen him in my life before or after the night where he first told us the tale. At least that was the case up until today. As I'm writing this, I'm sitting at the table in my living room. I have all the doors locked and windows bolted, with a piece of furniture propped up against each one to prevent anyone or anything from entering. I also have the radio on loud to drown out all of the sounds emanating from upstairs, those being the occasional creaking of the floorboards and other noises which I cannot identify. To be fair, I do live in a very old house, so perhaps those sounds are rationalizable. I have my mobile next to me, just one tap away from calling the police. It's 8 p.m., That means my parents should get home from their evening out in around 2 hours. I'll just sit tight until then, staring out of the window into my garden. Thankfully, nothing can get to my house without walking up the drive and passing through the well-lit front garden first. So I'll be able to call the police immediately if anything or anyone who I don't recognize starts approaching. My dog is lying flat on the floor a couple meters from me, staring up at me with a vacant expression. I think he can sense my fear. Nothing can get into the house without making an awful amount of noise. I know that now. I'll have time to flee and call the police on my mobile before anything bad happens to me. You see, there's just one problem that I blatantly ignored during my overanalysis of the situation. My parents took our dog with them on their trip. Whatever is currently lying meters away from me on the kitchen floor knows it cannot possibly be my dog. And as it begins to convulse, I fear it's realized that I've just come to the same conclusion.